So the North American capital projects industry has been facing many changes, and one is the pressures to reduce the reductions in carbon emissions in particular. And our building materials produce a lot of that. So what are the paths to success here? How can owners, architects, engineers, builders, and material suppliers collaborate to solve these challenges? Please join me in welcoming our next discussion with Bob Nussmeier with Baker Concrete, Nancy Kralik with Fluor, Julia Garbini with Concrete Advancement Foundation, Stacy Smedley with Building Transparency, Randy Kirchain with MIT, and Jim Ellis, retired from Microsoft.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Pleasure to have you for a brief few minutes, and we're going to try to stimulate your brain a little bit about this whole area of what's going on with carbon emissions and how, as building materials, can embedded carbon emissions be better managed as we get into the future. We mean this panel to be a panel that is diverse, each of them having their own area of specialization that allows for some interesting perspectives. We're not going to be able to solve or teach you best practice relative to this whole issue of embedded carbon emissions in 40 minutes. What we do want you to do is get motivated and passionate enough to, after this session, during the break, over at the exhibit hall, around the CII booth, spend some time with these dynamic 5 areas of expertise people. If you want to go to the bar, I'll be there. So anyway,
me too.
Most of you know me. The reason I'm here after 22 years of service at Construction Industry Institute is the fact that there's a passion about soon when I retire in 7 or 8 or 10 years, unless Baker gets rid of me sooner, I want to make sure there's a legacy that things are going much better relative to embedded carbon emissions, and one of the largest contributor of carbon emissions, which is the production of cement. And Baker put down some 2.5 million cubic yards of concrete last year, place and finish, pumped, structural, below grade, all. And when that's happening, 2 million yards of concrete, I don't want to tell you how many carbon emissions per ton of cement come from that large of a entity of our number 1 building material, which is concrete. So because of that, we've got to move forward at a fast pace. Lots of great things going on right now to reduce carbon emissions, and that's what we're going to talk about it. Not only in concrete, but all other building materials, whether it's steel, wood, aluminum, glass, all those areas we have carbon emission issues, and there's a lot of good things going on. So I just want you to make sure you have some chance to talk to these folks afterwards, and then they'll still probably be here, most of them at the reception. So with that, I want to just take maybe a minute or two with each of the panelists to just share a little bit about what you're all about and why this is part of your mission, starting with you, Nancy.
Thanks, Bob. I'm Nancy Kralik. I've been with Fluor for 20 years. Before that, major oil companies. And I lead the sustainability program for Fluor. We look at it in the team as air traffic controllers. So we gather a lot of information across multiple disciplines, we report it out, but we're also responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions program specifically. And we just attained at the end of June our net zero scopes 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions going to zero, and it'll be verified this fall. So it's really important to us. My personal interest is more the environmental side, biology background, and then civil and environmental engineering. And so I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about, from a contract standpoint, and what we do in sustainability and decarbonization.
Thank you. Jim?
Very good. Thank you, Bob. First, let me thank CII for having this on the agenda, number one. This is a very important topic, one of which I'm very passionate about. Spent about 45 years in this industry, right, in operations roles and construction roles, project roles. Retired from DuPont after 35, then I went to work for Sabic for 10 years to lead their global engineering and project delivery, and then ended my career with Microsoft, helping them hyperscale. And throughout my career, my passion continued to grow around this topic, right? I remember being part of the Business Council for Sustainable Development, which started in Texas back in the 1990s, and that perked my interest on this topic. Always had to operate safely in a sustainable environmental way. Never really realized the impact of this until I got kind of on in my career. And I'm now consulting with McKinsey on this topic, part-time. And then also, I've started my own company called Elysian. And Elysian is passionate about helping this industry really take sustainability to the next level. And we're not talking here scope 1, scope 2. My passion is the same as you on that. But our bigger challenge is on scope 3 emissions, the 80% of the problem. So I'm committed to continue to work. I failed retirement 4 times. I'm sure I'll fail at the 5th time. To help this industry really get value, equal value to what we do on safety, cost, and schedule, and put sustainability right up in front with those 4 things as we deliver our projects. So that's my passion for this.
Thank you, Jim. You are a man of passion, I know that. Katie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Poss. I'm the Program Manager of Procurement and Policy with Building Transparency. If you're not familiar, Building Transparency is a nonprofit hyper-focused on sustainability and construction, more specifically on addressing embodied carbon on the built environment. We want to provide the open access data and tools necessary to be able to calculate and reduce embodied carbon on construction projects. I'm relatively new to the organization. I joined Building Transparency in March of this year. Prior to that, I spent about 6 years with Turner Construction, addressing embodied carbon on data centers. So approaching this problem from the general contractor point of view. And I spent about a year with the National Ready Mix Concrete Association as their Director of Sustainability Initiatives, looking at this challenge through the lens of the manufacturer. But the common thread throughout my career has been trying to tackle this issue of embodied carbon. So excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Randy Kershane. I'm a principal research scientist at MIT, and I'm currently the director of the Concrete Sustainability Hub. My career has been focused on understanding the economic and environmental performance of materials in a number of industries. The last decade, I've been working on that in the built environment with the Hub, and the Hub is an industry-university partnership that's focused on solutions for realizing sustainable concrete. Just some things that we're excited about right now. You might have seen a story yesterday where we were looking at how do you add new functionality to concrete, actually even as far as making it a battery. But a lot of our work focuses on understanding, making better decisions about materials in the built environment. We have projects looking at how to optimize materials use, put the right material, the right amount of material in the right place. We have projects looking at how do we quantify that scope 3 that you heard Jim mention, using the information that you have available now. What we mean by that is you make decisions that in your own operations, and they have ramifications in other operations and throughout the operation of the building that you create. And then how do we even take that information and get a better sense? How do we benchmark the industry? How do we know that we're doing better over time? So those are some challenges that we're sort of tackling right now that we're really excited about.
Julie?
Right. Hi, I'm Julie Garbini. I'm Executive Director of the Concrete Advancement Foundation. I've had about 32 years of experience with concrete and construction-related organizations. But with the Concrete Advancement Foundation, we fund research and education to help advance the concrete industry towards the goals of decarbonization across the concrete construction value chain, promoting resilient communities and promoting world-class sustainable infrastructure. We do that through a variety of different partners and universities, but our signature program is that we fund the MIT Concrete Sustainability Hub, and we're really proud to work with them on the holistic effort towards sustainability for concrete and to kind of help with both feeding the research needs and helping to guide the research and provide data to inform their work, but then also for the industry deployment of the tools and the research that they develop and disseminating it to other stakeholders that are interested.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
So question number one, all you in the room have a big impact on this, but if you look at in North America, all the capital projects that we hope to build in the next decade, and you look at the challenges to reduce the embedded carbon emissions tied to the major building materials within those capital projects, whether it be steel, wood, glass, concrete, aluminum, what in your mind are kind of your favorite, couple of concerns that you really think we've got to kind of figure out if we're going to hit our goals that we want to hit? And I'll ask you first, Randy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really long list, I guess, but if I was to think of a couple that maybe that I would sort of challenge the industry on to address. One is earlier engagement with your supply chain. We know on the concrete side that this is a really big issue, is engaging with the supply chain earlier, both to learn what they can do now to provide you with a lower carbon solution, but also don't forget the importance of letting them know that the market is calling for that so that they can innovate solutions that will deliver that. I think another big challenge along those lines, we know that naturally this is a conservative industry, that it's always easiest to do the thing that has been done before. And so one of the, I think, key challenges is having early stage information so that people can see a vision of what they could accomplish on the environmental side if they did something different. And so I think that maybe provides the motivation to try something new, also helps to address some of maybe the risk aversion that's present that would sort of hold people back. So maybe those are two challenges I would throw out there, is we need earlier information and we need earlier engagement to develop those solutions.
Excellent. Jim?
So I'd like to go, we're all business leaders in the room here today, right? We talk about decarbonization as it's a cost versus a value. And so we have to start thinking about how we think about solutions, the technical solutions that are going to be developed, deployed, utilized. There's certainly a cost associated with this, right? We all recognize that. But we have to start treating like over time, this is going to create value for us across our industry as we treat it as equal to cost. I'll share with you one story about Microsoft, and because I heard the stories from the team and the contractors, the GCs, the EPCs, you're asking me to do this, you're asking me to put new materials in here. Number one, I don't have the materials, right? Nobody's developed them for me yet, substitutes for concrete, for example. And if I do, it's going to cost me a lot more. You're going to help me get kind of held kind of neutral on all of this, and the answer is just go do it, right? So there's got to be, to Randy's point, this collaboration that takes place. Leadership has got to step and say, I see it as a value. I'm willing to invest in it. Microsoft recognized this very, very early on. I'm proud of the decision they made, and this was at Satya's level, saying, hey, I know that my return on invested capital is going to drop when I do this down from where it is today, so my cost of capital is not going to be exceeded by my new projects. So $1 billion was put on the side. And that $1 billion was tapped into over time to say, I'm going to go out here and I'm going to utilize that on new innovations, helping the project teams offset some of the costs, not count it as part of the return on the project, even though it's part of the return of the company. And then that gets the momentum going that says, hey, we are going to do this, and over time, we're going to kind of bridge that strategy of the cost-value proposition. And we see that taking turn. So that's some of the bigger challenges I think all of us in this room are facing.
And that certainly helps on the leadership side. If it's shown to, speaking from the contractor side, we're happy to make recommendations, options, and so forth, but there has to be a recognition of trade-offs and strength of materials, structural integrity, liability, safety. And if we get that direction from the owner, that leadership, that goes a long way with the collaboration.
Katie?
Yeah, the first term that came to mind when I read this question was growing pains. And before I highlight a couple of challenges, I just want to say that this industry is known for innovation and evolving. You know, if you think about the built environment over the last decades and centuries, we have constantly evolved and innovated in the way we approach buildings and the materials that we use. So I'm encouraged by that we can change and we can address this challenge of decarbonization. But if there were 3 challenges that I had to pick, one is just access to reliable and comparable data. You know, we need more product, facility, and manufacturer-specific disclosures on the environmental impacts, including the carbon footprint of materials, so that we can accurately quantify and benchmark where we are today. Number 2, you know, policy. There are a slew of new public and private policies, and they're all kind of tackling the problem slightly differently. And as you can imagine, as a developer or a design firm or a contractor operating in multiple states or countries, that's a lot to keep up with, a lot of different regulations to try to adhere to. So I think if we can strive for some consistency and alignment in policy, that could go a long way. And then finally, just piggybacking off of Jim, you know, access to capital, particularly on the manufacturer side. There are a lot of solutions we could be implementing today. There's a lot of things with cement we could do, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. But these changes are not free. So having access to that capital and also bringing some of these new innovations and startups to scale are some of the challenges we're working to solve.
I mean, I would echo everything that everyone else just said. I do think, just to bring it back to that early communication, I think that's critical to understand what the goals are for the project, to understand what the performance requirements are, and I would say performance-based specifications so that it allows for that innovation to happen. I think, you know, there's a misconception that low-carbon concrete, as an example, isn't readily available. I mean, there are solutions that are tried and true today that are very accessible. I think we sometimes get a little bogged down because there's so much innovation happening right now, and it's very exciting. There's so many terrific things happening, but a lot of that hasn't been vetted and validated yet. But there are very tried and true approaches that you can take now, and if you work with your producers, your material suppliers, have those conversations early on up front, have the performance-based specifications that allow for that innovation and to meet those goals, you'll find that spot where you can reach the performance requirements and the sustainability goals as well as the cost goals all together.
Great, great. Well, my esteemed panel, your audience is engineers, constructors, architects, owners, service providers, material suppliers, all intricately critical as stakeholders to what happens on a major capital project. Your areas of expertise is to help us all drop the carbon emissions, particularly embedded emissions in the manufacturing materials, substantially. And that's our goal and our passion for climate warming. With that, you all have great suggestions and lots of paths that as a collaboration we should be taking. What's your kind of 2 favorite or so that we definitely need to get really good at in order to achieve this objective? And I'll start with you, Katie.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's going to take all of us. It's the responsibility for decarbonizing the supply chain or a project doesn't rest on one stakeholder's shoulders. It's not just the manufacturer's responsibility. It's not just the designer's responsibility. It's going to take everyone working together. You know, we've got owners who are establishing requirements, putting requirements and specifications. My first introduction to embodied carbon and EC3 was when Microsoft put requirements in their specifications that said on all projects going forward, you must calculate our emissions, our embodied carbon using EC3 and target a 30% reduction. Now there's nothing like putting requirements in a contract document to send a signal, right? And then you've got the GCs and the design firms who are trying to meet these requirements, use different tools, optimize the design, procure lower carbon products. And then you've really got the manufacturers on the front lines who are working diligently to bring forth ideas to the table that are not going to compromise quality, schedule, cost, and safety. So in that vein of cross-stakeholder collaboration, we've actually established a couple of different stakeholder working groups we're calling our carbon action networks. So we have owners can, contractors can, and materials can to try to foster some more of this collaboration towards action.
Great. Nancy?
It really comes down to collaboration, like Katie said, across the expertise. So there are people with expertise in delivery, people who know the new requirements or soon-to-be promulgated requirements on shipping and air emissions off that we didn't even consider them 6 years ago, 5 years ago. So looking at each entity and each phase of the project and who can bring the value to really look consistently rather than look at it as, okay, we have planning that's going on here, then we take that box of planning and then we take it to study, and then we take it to this next phase and so forth until finally it's built, and then, oh, by the way, we decommission it. If you're not looking at it as a complete project, then you'll miss opportunities to collaborate and really be able to optimize your carbon footprint.
Jim?
Yeah, maybe I want to build on that and then build on Katie, because I was at Microsoft at the time that we kind of promulgated to our contractors that they had to use EC3, but that was a collaboration process in and of itself. The development of the EC3 tool was not even available, and we got together as Microsoft with industry. Skanska was part of that. We came together and say, how are we actually going to baseline where we are today? Because we got a baseline before we move forward. And that tool then was developed, and then a process was put in place that basically said, okay, let's measure it. Let's look for the opportunities in a collaborative way, how we can actually put substitutes in there to drive a better, carbon environment for our projects. Pilot them and agree to pilot them. That was part of the $1 billion from Microsoft to pilot some of these projects, and then make it part of standard specifications, whether it be performance specs or Div 1 specs that come into our contracts. And we did all of that, and that was a collaborative effort. But I want to also build on your point that, and I'm just going to be bloody honest, we're not very good at really collaborating as a construction organization where we get construction into the very early phases of front-end development of our projects. We leave a lot on the table when we don't do that. And this is just another example that if we don't do that, Nancy, we're going to be in the same situation talking about IPD until we're blue in the face, but none of us are really delivering on an integrated project delivery strategy where we're all together as one community of practice that's trying to get the project to a better place. So I agree, that's something that we have got to do and do better at it with time.
Yeah, look what the pandemic did to collaboration relative to the supply chain.
Right.
We saw collaboration like we've never seen before because it had to get fixed. So does the carbon emissions. Yeah, that's good. I'm going to move on to another question quickly because there's so much good stuff here to talk about. But from your perspective, we've got, particularly with your area of research and data and findings, is we've got a lot of folks in the world, not only in North America, that are collaborating on new materials, new research, new ways of being able to reduce carbon emissions. There's so many different entities, whether it's universities, think tanks, companies, local state governments, all that. How, from your perspective, what is the area that you think would allow us to become a little bit more efficient to move technology from conceptual to use? I'm going to leave that to you, Julie.
Okay. You're right. There are so many different organizations doing that right now, but I think the good news is there are organizations doing that now, right? So, I mean, even 5 years ago, we didn't have a good process for that. So I think when you think about American Concrete Institute has a new hub called NEW that's looking at validating and vetting a lot of these technologies. MIT really excels at sort of a systems approach and looking at all these things, measuring them, finding out, triaging kind of where the biggest impacts can be made. but also quantifying the uncertainty of things that we don't know in the process. And in early stage design, there's a lot of unknowns, right? So they're very good at quantifying that uncertainty, having those kinds of tools, having those kinds of conversations, and I would say also leveraging other industries' knowledge. And again, I'll go to our relationship with MIT, but it's been really great for our industry to learn from automotive and the variety of different other industries, that chip manufacturers, other different industries. I think as a construction industry, we're typically not really good at that. We think that we're very unique, and we are in many ways, but we don't own this space. And so there's a lot to be learned from other industries. So I think the good news is that there are more people doing that, and how we harness it and kind of hone in on it, I think that's evolving quickly. But at least I do feel like we're all pulling in the same direction now.
Good. And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, so just kind of building off of what Julie said, one of the things I would challenge the industry to do is engage with the academic community. The research community, the number one thing that they want to accomplish is to have impact. And to have that impact, they need to know what are the real challenges you're facing now. And they're only going to know that if you engage with that community. So, if we think about the data challenge that was talked about earlier, that academic community is a good place to develop new data standards, develop the ability to benchmark, where the sort of phrase was brought up, how do we know whether we're making progress, right? So we need benchmarks, and we've gone a long way in developing those for materials, and Katie's company has sort of led the way in making that information available. But maybe if I roll back to one of the earlier questions about collaboration, we need to continue that collaboration throughout the supply chain to develop similar standards to measure. Katie mentioned it earlier. It's not just the materials, it's also the delivery in the construction activity, it's the building itself, it's the infrastructure project itself. We need to work together to develop the research to be able to evaluate at those levels as well, not just at the materials level.
And that's why CII is so important.
Yeah,
That's right.
The research project, for sure.
Yep, for sure, for sure.
Bob, building on CII, I'm going to tell you about an opportunity that you have. We reported out last year on RT380 circular economy. We now have the opportunity that CII is giving us to have a work group that'll be convening this fall. So please talk to Daniel about that. And it's sort of like we have a number of 380 folks who are joining, but we have other people we'd like to get involved. So I feel like taking from our favorite economist yesterday, only this is the Blues Brothers, when John Belushi's comment is, we're getting the band back together. So we're getting the work group together and invite you all to get involved, because circular economy is taking it from the front to the very end and back again. Thanks, Bob.
Oh, thank you. So this whole area of trusting, validating, and being able to completely believe that the data and the information of reduction in carbon emissions, how it's measured, how there are differentials between our country and other countries and all this jazz. How do we start doing a better job syncing that so that us that aren't PhDs in this area, like you are, Katie, can kind of figure this out and understand it on the board level? So with that, Katie, I want you to address that.
Yeah, that's a great point. There are a number of initiatives and efforts happening right now to align and standardize. One of the things we're involved with is an embodied carbon alignment initiative, where we have a lot of the public commitment programs. So for example, AIA 2030 DDX, SE 2050, MEP 2040, so on and so forth. And then the certifications, so LEED, ILFI, CITES, Envision. And then we've got Carbon Leadership Forum, Building Transparency, and a few others that are really looking at how we are quantifying embodied carbon, where are the gaps and misalignment in the standards, and how can we approach the back-end data in a consistent manner so that we can trust the numbers and we can compare the numbers with confidence. So I would say, continue to stay tuned as to what the products of that effort will be. But I'm very excited about the efforts put forth towards data alignment and standardization. It's very important.
Excellent. Now, Randy, as we get into looking at who's the cleanest versus the dirtiest building material, how do you see life cycle analysis as being important in that understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all materials, all technology, so I realize the panel is focused on embodied carbon, and that is a critical issue. I think every person along the supply chain needs to work towards that. But I think it's also important to understand that we need to evaluate technologies in terms of their life cycle performance, their emissions over time. So just to be clear about what we mean about that is that if I build a building, there are emissions from the materials that go into it, there are emissions from the activity to construct it, but the characteristics of that building also influence the energy and therefore emissions that are associated with it over its lifetime, and then eventually it is deconstructed and hopefully is repurposed in some way, but those activities also have emissions associated with it. So what I would say, is that a lot of times we get pushback on that question is, oh, that's so difficult. We have the information to answer those questions today. We have for some time. So that difficulty should not be a barrier to making informed decisions along those lines.
Jim, how did Microsoft view life cycle analysis?
Well, clearly it was front and center to our sustainability strategy with goals that all data centers will be 100% recycled. Mm-hmm. So when you start sunsetting servers, you had a strategy around servers that would be either refurbished or, sent someplace where components could be utilized into the additional building of new servers. Excellent. And we measured ourselves against that, actually put recycle facilities in several parts of the world so that it became front and center not only to a strategy but also to an action plan that we measured the target to 100%. So very, very important. Circularity, I want to build on the other part of the industry here. We have a lot of folks from oil and gas, and we say, well, we really don't have a lot around circularity. Well, I'll remind you that when I worked for SABIC, we developed the very first circular approach to polymers. We could separate different types of plastics across the globe, right, and mechanically separate them and kind of put them in and recycle to some extent. But when they came up with the ability to agnostically take all plastics and thermally decompose them and make them into a pie oil or pie gas, and then feed that back into an ethylene cracker to regenerate new plastics and polymers, that's true circularity. And clearly you talk about the value proposition from a business perspective, last time I mentioned that. We had customers waiting online to take that recyclable plastic and willingness to pay a premium for it because it came from a very clean, green place.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Some of you in the room are probably like me. You don't really understand anything he just said.
Most do, don't.
Not really. I was just kidding. So we've got a lot of pressure right now on the rising cost of a capital project. And it's affecting whether some of the projects are ever even going to get built. So to me, here's just another opportunity to drive more cost into the project. How would you address that issue when I'm talking to someone on the C-level saying, we'll do those things, and that's really good for what my grandchild is going to breathe in, but I'm sorry, it's another 15% or whatever additional cost to be able to do that. How do you address that? How do each of you look at that? And I want Julie, you to kick on and come all the way down. I want everybody to have a chance.
Okay, well, I'm probably the least qualified person to answer that piece of it, but I will say, I'll echo what Jim said. There are very cost-effective ways to reuse a lot of these materials, and as we look at circularity, I think there are big opportunities for cost savings or recouping on the back end for a lot of these solutions.
Good. Randy?
Yeah, one thing, so one thing I would point out is that's often overlooked. When you give a design team or innovator new criteria, they find new solutions. And so the reason that's really relevant is that the number one way that, or not the, one very powerful strategy for reducing the carbon emissions associated with any activity is being more efficient with the resources that are applied. That efficiency also can translate into cost savings. Yes. But because we're all normative, meaning that we like to just do the thing we did before, if I don't change up your metrics, I don't go and re-look at the solutions that I've looked at previously. And so I would throw out there that you may find many new approaches that not only reduce carbon, but also could be cost savings simply by introducing to the design teams, we need to look at this from a new angle. So carbon reduction is not always a cost increase.
Yeah, cost savings and revenue stream.
Right,
Exactly.
right.
Yeah.
Good point. Katie?
I would agree with that completely. I mean, I think just to piggyback on what Julie said, the most sustainable building is the one that's never built. I'm sure you've heard that before. But reusing materials, adaptive reuse, maybe we don't need that shiny new high tower. Maybe we can reuse or renovate an existing building and save on all of the cost and the embodied carbon emissions associated with the structural materials. But two, I recently saw a chart where it was something like the cost of embodied carbon reduction relative to the design phase, and that cost steeply rises as you progress towards procurement. So again, we've said it a couple of times up here, but that early engagement, talking about embodied carbon, the very beginning of the conceptual stage, the schematic design, how can we be the most efficient with our building, use less materials, and as they said earlier, bring on the ready-mix suppliers and the steel subcontractors in a design assist capacity at the very beginning. And your odds of success and lower costs are going to increase dramatically.
And if you need help with that, I'll just mention there are free resources out there for design assistance if you're not as familiar with some of these solutions. So as an example, if you go to buildwithstrength.com, they have a design assistance center, and they will consult on your project for free. So they will either design it for you or they'll consult and give suggestions of where the specifications can be improved for innovation or cost savings. So feel free to take advantage of those resources. They exist.
And what was that called, Julie?
Buildwithstrength.com.
Great, thank you.
And their design assistance center.
Jim?
I'm going to go back to a fundamental on the influence curve, right, which we all know very well in this room, being project professionals. And I'm going to state the way we get around this is back exactly what the guys are saying here. We got to get more efficient. Well, how do you do that? You have to do that by design. You have to be collaborative. You have to bring in the right integrated team early on to think through the solutions. I don't know how many of you recall the value improving practices. I think they came out of IPA many, many years ago, right? Why wouldn't we have a sustainability value improving practice on every project we have that helps to do, the trade-off discussions that have to happen very early on in project development? The other point I would say is, and we talked about AWP today, right? Advanced work packaging. Fewer hours, less materials, more efficient is going to be by default more sustainable.
And it's healthy.
So I think there's a big connection between advanced work packaging and doing the right level of planning very early front and getting the value through the project process at a lower cost, more efficient, including schedule.
And machine learning in general is going to improve the data and the credibility of the data as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are you seeing carbon emissions or carbon emissions impact as a line item in early feasibility discussions on a project with owners?
I think we are, especially the tech sector. Academia has expressed interest. I think more and more we are seeing carbon as a line item or even a question in an RFP. When I was at Turner, we were using this term carbon value engineering. How can we propose lower carbon alternatives and propose the cost and carbon impact side by side so owners can make informed decisions? But if you're a contractor or design firm, you don't have to wait for the owner to ask. You can voluntarily propose those strategies and initiate that conversation.
Very good. Baker's had an example where at one time the directive to us on a 14-story tall building, concrete frame, was to drop the job site carbon emissions under our functions substantially, and then compare that with doing that with the embedded carbon with concrete materials. And doing lots of interesting things, some things causing money, electrification, all kinds of stuff, recycling, a lot of those things all added up to X. And then when we went to the structural engineer and said, we can build all these if you turn to these type performance mix designs, which each of them contain 70 pounds per cubic yard less cement, the carbon emissions reduction by doing that was 110 times more than what we could do on the job site in carbon emissions in the production and the erection and placement of concrete. So it's really interesting, very interesting. So let me ask one more question that is always the magic answer. We need substantial incentives and answers from the public sector in Washington, in our State House, and every place else to create vehicles that allow us to make these monumental leaps in technology and performance. What are some of the things, I mean, it's not a question whether you agree with that statement. The question is, what are some of the things, good and bad, that you see going on relative to legislation, governance, incentives, all kinds of stuff coming out of the pocket of the taxpayer or wherever it's coming from to help move this along so the pain is not quite so difficult for the specific owner or developer of a large project. Julie?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question there's a ton of money being thrown at climate right now, so that there are a lot of grant programs out there and opportunities to take advantage of incentives and grant money to, you know, either for capital improvements, for research, a whole variety of things. But I think, you know, bringing it back to the engagement piece, really getting engaged in, you know, even your local community, looking at these issues all the way up, you know, federal, state, local. Being engaged in those conversations early on so that they understand our industry, so that they understand what it means to us, so that they are making good policy and understanding how it's going to affect the full concrete or full value chain of the construction project. I think that's critically important. We need to be engaged early on in those conversations before bad policy is put in place. It's very easy to complain about it after the fact, but engagement up front is really key.
Yeah, and I'd like to mention that there are regulations coming up that we have been fortunate that we have done a lot voluntarily, but starting in Europe, Fluor and a number of other companies operating there, we're going to have to start reporting, and it's going to be much more visible what our emissions are, and not just greenhouse gases. So we're going to be pushed as well. The C-suite's going to have to consider that when it's not just a matter of ROI.
Excellent. Other thoughts?
I have a thought on the process of itself, but it's more related to permits and maybe a stakeholder we haven't talked about today. That's our communities. They're really defining our right to operate. They're becoming much more sophisticated today, no matter where you are in the world. And the expectations are constantly increasing. And they're utilizing that as a leverage. We don't need NGOs any longer to go and kind of lobby on behalf of being more sustainable. The communities will do that for you, and they're coming out, and I'll use a data center example, and the challenges we had on site selection is you're not putting that generator in our backyard. And the reason you're not, because we know it's a source of carbon emission. Tell me what you're doing about it. And so therefore, what I'm seeing on a lot of these more technology-focused projects and data centers, that what's becoming critical path is the early intervention, engagement with your community stakeholders to really be transparent in what we're doing as an industry and share with them, you know, the goodness that we're all about, and kind of convince them to be supporters of us. Today, the critical path on projects is permits in that particular technology sector of getting capital projects done. So I think we need to pay attention to that too. Yeah, the tax incentives are great. They come with somewhat of a negative too in the community. But more importantly, you need that community support in order to maintain your right to operate moving forward for the next 30 to 40 years.
Part of the collaboration.
You bet.
And bringing it back to what Randy had mentioned earlier, looking at the full life cycle. Embodied carbon is obviously critically important, and it's a big focus right now, but if we're truly gonna make an impact, you have to look across the full life cycle. And a lot of policy right now is being aimed only at the embodied carbon piece, so that we need to be able to shape policy to make appropriate comparisons, make sure that reporting is transparent, equal, fair, and also looking across the full life cycle.
Yeah, just to build on that, a couple of different examples of what we're seeing in policy are, one, just requiring disclosure via submission of environmental product declarations. So some states or cities or entities are doing sort of a benchmarking exercise, requiring that disclosure just to see where they're at. What is the carbon footprint of the concrete or the steel that's being used in our community? Then there are some approaches where they're setting those product level limits. They're setting a GWP limit per cubic yard of concrete or per ton of steel. But we're seeing more and more of these sort of incentive-based approaches, which, as Jim mentioned, are good and bad in some ways. But you know, in New Jersey, there was just a tax incentive passed this year where projects can earn up to an 8% tax rebate for use of lower carbon concrete. But I agree with Julie, and in Europe, they really have taken more of a whole building approach to policy. And I think as we see more of the data and standards and tools improve, that we will see a shift here in the US towards that whole building approach.
Excellent. Audience, it's a good time to shoot any questions to Jill if you want. So, Katie, if you look at where are the holes in looking at rational information of what the true carbon footprint of a particular building material is?
Great question. Some of the holes in looking at the carbon footprint, having accurate supply chain data, let's take concrete as an example. You could look at an EPD for a mixed design of concrete, and it could either, and if you're not aware, cement is about 80 to 90% of the carbon footprint impact of a concrete mixed design. It is largely impacted by the cement. So an EPD for concrete could include industry average data for cement, or it could include product-specific data from the actual cement plant that cement is being procured from. So you need to be able to trust that data. You need to know that it's as accurate as possible. So trying to improve the accuracy of the data is definitely something that the industry is working on. And then when we look at tools, I remember asking, it was a webinar I attended, and there are a couple of different tools out there for whole building life cycle assessment. And I asked the question, if I were to input the exact same building in each of these tools, would I get the same result? And the answer is no. The background data and the inputs in these tools and the standards are not so prescriptive. There's a lot of room for interpretation. So as you can see, this common theme around standardization of data and the inputs and the numbers, we have some work to do there.
If I could just build off of a point that I think Katie was making, but might have been slightly implicit, is that we need to move towards that supply chain specific declaration. Unless you're measuring the thing that's related to what you're purchasing, it's not going to have the same kind of signal to change practices in that supply chain. So one of the biggest holes right now, and it was important to get data moving, is relying on averages, but one of the things we need to be moving towards is more facility specific, or what the jargon is, a supply chain specific evaluation.
Do you see one building material over another having advantages in the state information?
I mean, the concrete industry has the widest set of it, or the largest set of these EPDs that have been developed. I think that all of the major material systems have efforts in place. To me, a lot that comes that discrepancy a lot comes about. We need market pull for that information, and if the market is pushing for that information, then the supply chains will develop it. You know.
I think that's really the key is market pull. And we've seen that's how sustainability has advanced in general. I think that, all the way down the line, folks have responded when it's been demanded. There needs to be that next level of demand.
What are some things we can be doing to make sure that state, local, and federal legislation doesn't come out where it's not productive?
I mean, I think Julie mentioned you need to be engaged. You need to be aware that throughout the country there are conversations. Jim mentioned actually communities, and maybe just to be a little bit more specific, it may not even be a state level regulation. Cambridge has its own carbon measurement regulation that will take into effect next year. And so even individual cities are implementing these. So, I think being aware and being engaged, and I think the one piece I'd really challenge this audience is to make sure that the construction sector's views or roles in that are carried through. Bob and I were talking at lunch that a lot of these programs are focused on incentives that may not address some of the risks that a contractor might face that are from adopting a new material or new technology. So policymakers need to be aware of that as a barrier to for the policy to actually have the effect they intend.
Yeah.
So.
And there needs to be shared risk across the value chain.
Right.
Tim?
I think the other piece of awareness is at the C-suite. So, I mean, we're all sitting here, and our organizations are lobbying for these regulations and policy, and a lot of it's frankly focused on scope 1, scope 2. Construction's not at the table at the C-suite, kind of reporting out what the pain we have in terms of delivering. Well, that pain's going to translate back to all of us, right, including the corporation, when you're only addressing 20% of the problem. The 80% of the problem is not being dealt with. So I think you've got to engage your C-suite in building awareness that, your capital project delivery is the biggest influencer in this. Concrete's 11% of the challenge, right? Close to it. Well, concrete and steel together are 11% of the challenge. So I think there's a piece of work to be done, as Randy described, but I also think there's a piece internally that has to be done too, to say, hey, we've got to get the right lobbying strategy to influence in a broader way.
Well then, let me close by saying with give us two mandates that as an owner of an engineer, procurement, construction, service provider, and overall construction material suppliers, what's a couple mandates that we should go back and talk to our senior level management about tomorrow? Nancy, start with you.
Really going back from the contractor standpoint, getting involved early, so it would be educating the salespeople in discussions with the owners about the collaboration effort would be the number one thing I would think.
Okay, we'll get a hold of Mr. Brown and make sure he starts doing that. Jim?
No, I agree with Nancy, what she said here, but I would say we could, as organizations, we can also start building some of this into our Division 1 specs, but in the collaborative spirit of let's align that we can practically do that, and what's the cost associated with it, but work that as a team, not as an organization of owners.
Katie?
Yeah.
I guess if there were two, free low-hanging fruit things that you could start doing today, host a sort of embodied carbon charrette on every project. Take an hour or two, bring all the project stakeholders together and talk about what can be done on this project. In that same vein, in every invitation to bid, ask for lower carbon alternates. Ask for the subcontractors and the suppliers to bring their ideas to the table to evaluate for use on your projects.
Those are all excellent ideas. Maybe if I just add a couple that haven't been mentioned. One thing I would say is do something. And what I mean by that is that I realize that this can seem very intimidating, and you see some companies that are doing very sophisticated things, including full life cycle assessment. You don't have to jump all the way to that. Start somewhere. Measure the footprint of your own activities, and even recognize, Bob mentioned that maybe your supply chain has much more leverage than your own. But one of the things I found with engaging with companies of just starting to measure their own is that helps develop the insights to understand where those big points of leverage are. So even if you're not being asked, start doing that measurement so that you're ready to differentiate yourself when you do begin to get that request.
Yeah. Set a carbon goal for the project up front, bring together the stakeholders with their ideas to help you get there.
Great. That's good. A couple questions from the audience. One's a kind of a technical one on our part of the side, so I'll throw this at you, Julie, and Randy. But tell us about what's going on with Type 1L cement. It seems like a no-brainer that everybody should use it. Why isn't that happening?
Yeah, I think the cement industry's done a lot to bring that infrastructure up to speed to be able to deliver that. And so I think that's been an ongoing process just even in the last couple of years. So it's much more accessible now. There are definitely growing pains with it. And, Bob, you and I have talked about this with the Baker team. And I think we're seeing it on the ready mix side too. It's different. It's not worse in any way, but it's different. And I think there's challenges. So again, it goes back to that communication of talking about accessibility, but also how you use it in the field and the variation with it, so that we're meeting the project goals, and everybody across the chain knows what to expect.
Good. Katie and Jim, here's an interesting one. Do you think owners need to add a light item for decarbonization score with all the large building construction, EPC, GC concerns that are going to build a project?
Should they add a carbon score in evaluating proposals? I think it should definitely be a criteria, but I don't think that the onus should rest solely on the general contractor. As we've mentioned several times today, the design is the largest driver of embodied carbon, and there's only so much that can be done in procurement. So I think, yes, it should be evaluation criteria, but it should also be a cross-stakeholder responsibility. But yes, absolutely should be evaluated in some way.
So I'll build on that from an owner's perspective. When we think about going to FID on a lot of these large capital projects, we take a look at what? We take a look at cost, we take a look at schedule, we take a look at market, but we don't take a look at sustainability, which is an equal, I would say, impact at the table with net present value of a project and return on invested capital. So I think owners should start to think about that. Microsoft did, so you would see a line item on there on a carbon score versus the last data center that was built. What have you done to improve moving forward? And have you met, as a GC, that 30% year-over-year target that we set for you in the Division 1 specs that actually got looked at?
It's excellent. What employees that work for us all, and in all our companies, do they have a role to play in this whole arena? And if so, what could they be doing to help?
Yeah, I think 100%. And, it goes back to something we haven't touched on very much is training, education and training. I mean, we really need to train all the way from, just like with safety, all the way from the top line down to the frontline employee. We need to instill that culture of sustainability and train what they can do to impact it. So really that we train a workforce of climate innovators.
I'll just add a couple of opportunities that are emerging. There's definitely a need for more formal training, especially related to embodied carbon accounting and whole building lifecycle assessment. I know the British Columbia Institute of Technology just put forth a micro-credential related to whole building lifecycle assessment. We're happy to host a demo or a lunch and learn on how to use the EC3 tool. We do that often for owners and design firms and contractors. But also I see, especially in general contractor firms and design firms, where you've got the sustainability people, and that's their job, and nobody else really knows. So especially on the GC level, the estimating team, the pre-construction and procurement teams need to be up to speed on what embodied carbon is and how we might approach that on a project.
Bob, you and I have talked about the interesting analogy between safety and sustainability. And if you don't have people throughout the workforce looking for safety challenges, they're not going to be brought up, they're not going to be addressed. And I feel like we need that same type of innovation happening on the sustainability side. You need throughout the workforce enough knowledge to understand how the decisions that are made in day-to-day, whatever that day-to-day is for that individual, have influence on these, whether it's ordering too much material or not using the right material in the right application, or discarding something that could be reused in another application. So those kind of insights that kind of intuition needs to be throughout the workforce for us to really see the kind of changes that we're going to need.
And by the way, I think that's a win for your company culture too, especially with this new generation coming up. I mean, I work with a lot of different universities, and I work with an undergraduate degree program in concrete industry management. And far and away, this next generation of folks coming up, they care about sustainability. They ask that question when they're walking into companies looking for a job. So they care very much about it, and I think it's a win, number one, to be able to train and show professional development, but also it's something that they care passionately about. So it's a good company culture to set anyway, aside from the fact that you really want to be able to make a difference.
I want to go back to the safety analogy Randy made, because I think it's really powerful, right? So we always have safety organizations within our organization, but we always say that the line owns safety. Why doesn't the line own sustainability all the way down to the shop floor?
Personal responsibility.
You bet. Drive accountability.
From the seat to the craft. Yeah. Very good, very good. Well, what a cool panel. A lot of you, I know, are going to get some commingling and discussion and some chat time at our break coming up. And again, over by the CII booth, anybody in the audience that has additional questions with these diverse experts. And I think we see this time and time again. The solutions to this obvious issue lies within this room, and we all own a little piece of it. So I just encourage you to continue to indulge in solution providing and activity in not only your area of expertise, but within the organization. And with Construction Industry Institute now having a specific focus on decarbonization research, I think participating in that through others that are already there as consultants, advisors, or just somebody that says, we really do care and we want to see this done is a really good thing. I hope you agree with that, Jamie. All right. Well, thank you very much. And we enjoyed it, audience.